and welcome to the program. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a new week and I wish you all a very productive week. This is Moneyline with Nancy and I am Nancy Naji. Today on the program we'll continue our discussion around the GDP data that was released last week by the National Bureau of Statistics, and we will get our discussion started. My guest is with me right now, is joining us from Lagos, I suppose. Johnson Chukwu is the Group Managing Director of Cowry Asset Management. Mr. Chukwu, welcome to the program and let's get started.
Thank you, Nancy, for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing? Is Mr. Chukwu, I can't see you, I can hear you. Director, please, can you punch that button? Okay, so.
What? Can you see me now?
Yes, I can see you now. Okay, so let's get started. The National Bureau of Statistics released the data for last year, the full year GDP report, as well as Q4. It indicated that the nation's economy grew 3.4% in 2021. But I would like you to give me your own reading about the GDP data. And let me try to collate my thoughts so that you would understand my question. I want you to give me your reading about this GDP data in terms of the nation's size and not the nation's welfare. Because we tend to be caught across that when we get to hear of GDP, we'll be like, oh, how does it affect? How does it bring money to my pocket? How does it raise my income? And all of that. I know it's a little bit correlated, but I want to get your reading in that sense.
Okay, my take on the GDP figure that was released last year by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics is that one, in the first place, this is the first time the GDP is growing about 3.4% above the population growth rate. So it's a positive. I'll dwell more on that before I come to the aspect of the question you asked, how does it relate to the population in terms of beyond the figures. We have to recognize the fact that we must not fail to recognize the fact that the GDP contracted in the preceding year, that's 2020, by 1.92%. And I always want to emphasize this. It's a good growth, but if you discountenance the fact that it contracted last year, you will not actually appreciate the fact that the GDP is still very fragile, the GDP growth is still very fragile. Remember what happened in 2020 was that the economy contracted by 1.92%. So we started growing from a lower base. And that meant that if the economy had remained static in 2020 and did not contract, the growth we saw in 2021 would have been at best about 1.48%. Because if you consider that the GDP contracted by 1.92% the preceding year and grew by 3.4% the next year, so if you had assumed that the GDP remained where it was, it didn't contract in 2020, then the growth of 3.4% would have amounted to something like 1.48%, which meant that the GDP growth is still very fragile. But that base effect, the fact that you're growing from a lower base, gave us a higher growth rate, or what we may call a wind effect on the GDP growth. So having said that, that will not in any way dismiss the fact that a 3.4% growth in the GDP is higher than what we were used to. And if we continue that growth rate, if we can maintain it year on year, if we can have a compound annual growth rate of 3.4%, then over time, we will begin to improve the living standard of Nigerians. We'll begin to see improvement in almost all the major macroeconomic parameters: employment level, inflation rate, exchange rate. All those will begin to improve if we have to sustain a growth above the population growth rate. Unfortunately for us, what we've had in the previous years was that the GDP had been growing at below the population growth rate. And when you are producing, when the quantity of goods and services being produced in an economy is lower than the number of people being added to consume that additional quantity of goods and services being produced, it simply means when you distribute the GDP per capita, or what they call per capita GDP, you will realize that that per capita income will continuously decline, which simply means on an average basis, the standard of living of that population is deteriorating.
Okay, I think you tried to answer my question, and let me also say why I asked it earlier, because for modern economies right now, GDP is not the true measure of welfare. I do know that economic growth is also beneficial, but for some people or for some countries, they do use, I think, what they call the ease of living index, or even what's the living wage in those countries. Now, I haven't answered that. Would you really attribute this growth that we saw, the growth of 3.4% last year, to Nigerians getting more jobs? And I know why I'm asking. Will this growth be attributed to Nigerians, more Nigerians getting more jobs, or that money supply, production, or productivity was high in the hands of those that are already existing?
Okay, in that case, you're asking two barrier questions. One, do I think that the level of unemployment has improved as a result of the growth in the economic activity, productive activity in the country? Or do I think that the growth had no impact on employment? What I would say is that when you begin to see growth, you are going to see some impact on employment, but there's also like what they call lag effect. That lag effect will mean that sometimes companies will first exhaust their installed capacity. Remember, I said earlier that the economy contracted. When the economy contracted, what that would have meant is that companies are supposed to, some companies retrenched, level of employment declined further. And at the time when demand increased in the subsequent year, what companies will first do is to stretch the existing employment to see if they can continue to produce to meet the improved demand for goods and services. It's only after they have exhausted the capacity of existing installed resources or labor to produce more goods and services that they begin to go back to the labor market to employ more. So what you may have seen is that during that period, because of the lag effect, because if you also have to look at the sector that actually grew in the last year. The strongest growth we had in the entire year was in the financial services sector that grew by about 10%. Then followed by the trade sector that grew by about 8%. And because trade sector had a major contraction previously, so that growth was largely driven by base effect. The financial services sector is also not a sector that is a sector that is migrating away from physical employment to automation. So you realize that a lot of the value added, a lot of the additional value created in the financial services sector were created by improvement in level of automation, which will mean that it did not require so much of active additional human capital resource to grow that. Then the sector that actually major pool or major sources of employment did not grow so much. Agricultural sector actually the growth in agricultural sector for the year was only about 2.12% for the entire year. And that's a further decline from the previous agricultural sector growth in 2020, which will mean that in terms of employment, and agriculture is the largest employer of labor in the country, that sector was not expanding. Then the other sector as a major employer of labor is the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector's growth, we are largely driven by two factors. One, sub-market interest rate that was granted by the central bank. So we must give central bank some credit for the growth in the manufacturing sector, because the manufacturing sector enjoyed sub-market rate. So they had a subsidized interest rate, and that helped them to produce at lower cost, or their cost of production to reduce. Then we've also seen, because of the depression we had in 2020, we've also seen some level of improvement in consumption. That improvement in consumption is not strong enough as to lead to increase in employment at the manufacturing sector. Some of the things we are seeing is that we need to have a stronger growth in consumption, because one of the weaknesses of the economy today is weak consumption, weak purchasing power, which has led to weak consumption. Because when you are manufacturing to the warehouses, you are manufacturing to the retailers' shop floors, and the ultimate consumption is not taking place, you find out that over time, your ability to the demand for your product will begin to decline, and your ability to sustain that production level will also weaken. So the growth we saw in the GDP may not have dovetailed or trickled down to the point where we begin to create so much employment. Of course, you can see some marginal improvement in employment, but I do not think we're going to see a material improvement in development employment, given also that more and more people are coming to the labor market. And the rate at which people are coming to the labor market far above the rate of recovery we've seen in the GDP, as to absorb more labor than those coming to the labor market.
So from your explanation, I'll take it to mean that perhaps the impact of the helicopter money that we saw in 2020 and also 2021, and even for the monetary authorities extending even moratorium right now to even next year, perhaps had an impact. Not necessarily that many Nigerians had jobs within the year 2021. I'll take it to mean that.
Yes, absolutely. I do not think so much jobs were created in 2021, because you have to assess what sectors were creating those jobs. I had explained that the sector that grew were not largely job-creating sectors. Even the manufacturing sector was enjoying some level of subsidy that helped them to produce at lower cost. And I also say, because you don't have so much consumer demand, money did not go into the consumer's hands. So actual consumption was not so strong as to trigger the level of production that will require them to ask for additional input materials.
Why I asked that question really is that GDP is about output, what you're producing, what I'm producing, goods and services, production and consumption. That was why I had to put in that question and to see if indeed Nigerians had more jobs as a result of this improved GDP numbers. And I must say that this, since 2015 really, this is the strongest growth of this administration since 2015, because we've seen two recessions, anyway. We've seen two recessions within this administration. We've also seen this is the highest growth so far, 3.4% full year. I'll come back to the agriculture sector a little bit later, but let's talk about other sectors that seem not to get into the news all the time, because anytime GDP comes out, we're always boxed into a corner of talking about manufacturing, agriculture, and perhaps services. But let's take a look at other sectors, even within the services sector. Sectors such as ICT, sectors such as real estate, sectors such as, you mentioned earlier, finance sector, not necessarily insurance. We also have sectors such as accommodation, arts and entertainment. How can these sectors be encouraged so that those sectors are more business and investment friendly, that will make the pie larger, that you get a lot of people in that sector?
Well, I think we already have a proof of concept, the telecommunication sector, which is now the third biggest contributor to the GDP. If you look at the structure of Nigeria's economy, you realize that agriculture still accounts for about 26% of the GDP, followed by trade, about 15.6%, followed by telecommunication, about 15.2%. And then after that, you have the manufacturing sector, and then followed by the oil and gas sector. And then you have the construction sector, the real estate sector, the financial services sector. Given that the communication ICT sector used to be an infinitesimal contributor to the GDP, and then policies of government encourage the growth of that sector. And that sector is 100%, let me say 100% driven by the private sector, because today they don't have public sector owned or operated telecommunications services. So what that means is that we can replicate the same concept that we did. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't because we prayed and then telecommunications sector began to function. It was because we came up with the appropriate policies, did the licensing of the telecommunication operators, a transparent licensing system that allowed these sector investors to come in and acquire those licenses. And this private sector investors have invested so much in infrastructure in that sector. They have mass to do. We now have optic fibers, several of them that have come into this country. We now have 3G, and they've just been licensed to provide 4G services. And all those investments coming from private sector, all the government was doing is sit back, come up with policies, come up with appropriate regulations, and money will come to them. Only recently, about 2 of them got licenses for the 5G, and each of them is paying about $273.6 million, which gives national port of over $500 million. And that concept can be replicated. Let's take for instance the construction industry. If we identify viable private sector, commercially viable infrastructural assets, and we concession them to the private sector, we're going to get money from the concessioning. Private sector capital will come into those sectors. We create employment, we build infrastructure, and at the end of the day, we as a country will get the benefit of those infrastructure. But unfortunately, we're not doing that. We believe we can build infrastructure from budgetary allocation, which unfortunately, because of our lean resources, we are not doing that. I know the government has come up with some schemes that will allow private sector to build some roads. And unfortunately, they need to move faster because we're approaching the election period when whatever does not achieve some level of traction will be jettisoned by a new government. So, but ultimately, we can use that to kickstart and grow the construction industry. The real estate sector, all we just need is developing infrastructures away from the centers of town, cities, so that people can actually build viable estates, live in upscale estates away from the city centers. But for that to happen, you must be able to commute to the city center. So you need likes of monorail that can take people to city centers so that they can live away from city center. They can actually live in up-country locations and commute to city centers to do business. But that will require infrastructure from government. I've talked about how we can do the infrastructure. And that way will expand the opportunities in the real estate sector. Today, the most viable real estate sectors are in Lagos and Abuja. And then you also look at the extant law in terms of getting approvals to develop properties, approve the process it takes to get approvals to build, and other taxes that govern construction industry or real estate industry in each location. We need to streamline these things and make it easy for contractors or real estate developers to get titles to their developments and also get approvals to build and all those things. And we must also make sure we have appropriate regulatory structures to monitor development so that we don't have the incident that happened in Lekki and Ikoyi repeat itself. That way we will have a more viable real estate sector. All these other sectors that you mentioned, the financial services sector, which accounts about 3.4% of the GDP today, that sector is largely driven by the private sector. And what we need is strong regulations, strong policies. The largest pool fund managers in the country today, other than the banks, are the pension fund administrators. And that came about as a result of policy. It was under President Olusegun government that we came up with the Pension Reform Act. And today they are managing about 13 trillion naira in assets under management, driven by policy. So the key thing is that policy is important, leadership is important in coming up with policies and making sure that you have also strong regulations to guide each of, to define, protect, and guide each of these sectors that you want to stimulate.
Okay. Let's talk about the most talked sector, which is the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector is the largest employer of labor, but yet it doesn't have as much very high productivity, which we expect. What do you think that is missing? That's the A part of the question. The B part of the question is, do you also think we are getting it wrong in terms of saying that we've got to develop this nation through the agricultural sector? Because if you take a look at modern economics, they've moved beyond the three basic needs of life, which is food, shelter, and clothing. There are other things, basic needs of life right now. Those ones are fundamental. So are we also getting that conversation wrong in the country in terms of, oh, let's build on agriculture, let's build on, we are blessed with this. It happened in the 50s and 60s. Should it be the kind of conversation that we should be having? That's the B part of the question. I hope you've not forgotten the A part of the question, which is largest employer of labor, but not so much of high productivity.
Okay, let me start with the A part of your question. The reasons why agricultural sector is not, of course, the growth of 3.58% was one of the highest in terms of quarterly growth. But like I said, full year growth was only 2.12%. The reason why agricultural sector is not as viable as it should be multifaceted. I would like to capture some of those factors. One, we do not have our Land Use Act makes it difficult for people to gain access to commercial agricultural land. So you have a lot of agricultural activities is peasant. So it's based on physical sweat that people are using to cultivate the land. Two, we do not have supporting infrastructure. If someone infrastructure will come in form of irrigation, if we have irrigated areas, you may realize that we may expand the period, our cultivation cycle. Take, for instance, the southeastern part of the country, where you can actually have both the upland rice and the paddy rice cultivation. But unfortunately, in the southeast part of the country and the south part of the country, what you have only produced is the paddy rice because there's no irrigation that will allow you to produce during the dry season. Similarly, you can also, if you have irrigation, you can also produce maize, 3 cycles of maize production in a year. So critical infrastructure is missing. Third factor is the storage. We don't have storage facilities. Most of the silos are located in areas that the farmers are not even aware. To take the product from their farm gate to the silos is almost an impossibility. So you need to have storage facilities to reduce the wastages we have in the food products that are produced. You realize during the seasons, you have so much of commodity food items produced. Off-season, the quantity supplied is also so quite low because you're unable to store them. Take for instance, things like maize can be effectively stored and you have a lot more of that available in off-season period. Fourth factor is the transport infrastructure that will allow you to take products from where they are produced to where they are demanded. Because of collapse of our transport road infrastructure, we don't have efficient rail infrastructure. You realize that where these food items are being produced, it's difficult to evacuate them to where they are demanded. And then the other factor is in terms of benefication, value addition, processing factories or industries that can produce some of these food items or some of these farm produce into semi-finished product or even fully finished product. We produce cocoa. We have it. We have a few of those cocoa products being utilized in terms of as a final product for consumption. We have cassava that you can turn into a starch. Most of those things are not being done here. So you need to address these 5 items I mentioned for us to begin to enjoy the benefit of farming as it is. Remember, like, taking us to the next aspect of your question, farming is an extractive industry. That is the first level of human commercial activity, or when people moved away from being hunter-gatherers and they began farming. So farming, as it stands today, in other countries of the world, farming is at best a source of having food security. Farming, the way we practice it, cannot be a basis for an economy to leapfrog into a developed economy. It will at best be a source of food security. It's necessary we produce and eat what we produce, so we don't depend on other countries for our food supply, but you are not going to transform it into a source of industrialization in today's world. It cannot be. Today, the world is talking of knowledge economy. Mm-hmm. They are not talking of extractive industries. There's no country in the world that is relying on extractive industries among the most developed countries of the world. It's all about the value additions, the kind of knowledge you have in your society. So we must change the narrative when it comes to farming and recognize what best it can achieve for us. It cannot be the source for this country to begin to compete with the likes of Malaysia or Japan or China or even India.
Okay, let's take a look at this from this prism, which is the stay-at-home order that is happening in the Southeast, at least for those states in the Southeast, because when I took a look at these GDP numbers, every Monday, today is Monday, those Southeast states, it's like they're on lockdown. Many businesses are not going on right now. Are you seeing that this is also impacting the GDP in no means, however small it is? And I'm really so surprised that the governors of the Southeast are just so mum about this, and everybody is just pretending as if nothing is happening. Quite a whole lot of insecurity going on there. I'm looking at the economic impact. So you can imagine if these Southeast states, which are highly commercial states where production or even consumption happens, distribution to consumption happens. What do you have to say about this? Because since no one wants to talk about it, and I'm taking the plunge.
Well, interestingly, I also shouldn't want to talk about it because I want to share away. I never share away from political activity, but because we're going to take it from
it's not political anymore. It's not political.
Yeah, because we're taking it from because
yes, economy. Yes.
The reality is when you lock down economies consistently every Monday, you are losing productive activities. If you take, for example, about where they produce shoes, produce leather bags, it simply means whatever is produced on a daily basis is lost because of the lockdown. But I also think that over time they will begin to circumvent it. Like the people who produce those things, they will stay in their shops and work all through the night and not leave their shops. But ultimately, we are having lots of productive activities in the Southeast states. I have heard, think one of the leaders of Igbo, former Ohanese, the president said, look, that the ongoing sit-at-home is no longer a directive of IPOB. That is basically some criminal elements that are involved in enforcing the so-called sit-at-home order. But you also look at the structure of the economy of the Southeast. A large percentage of the market activities there is in the rural areas. So what those people, the farmers, they go to farm on Mondays, they don't even know whether they talk of sit-at-home or not. But as per entirety of the economy is suffering from the lockdown. And the earlier the leadership of that section of the country recognizes and rises up to that, the better for the society. Ultimately, a lot of people are peasants there. They live hand to mouth. So when you deny them of working on Mondays, you are denying them a percentage of their income for the week, more than 10% of their income for the week, maybe about 30% of their income for the week. For those who work 7 days, and for those who work 5 days, you're denying them something like 20% of their income for the week. So their standard of living will continue to deteriorate. The ability to meet their obligations to their family will continue to decline. And unfortunately, the political leadership may not be in a strong moral position to enforce, to counterbalance or counteract the efforts of the so-called enforcers of this sit-at-home policy. Because if they have strong followership, they can galvanize the people to oppose a few people who are compelling them to sit at home and suffer hunger.
Okay, Mr. Chukwu, I have one last question for you before you go. For those that will look at this GDP data, or perhaps even not for those, for Nigerians that would see this GDP data and perhaps want to, interpret it in ways that the MBS has released this data, how does it concern me as a business person, as an investor? Does this GDP data really signal new sectors that investors can come in, or even business startups, or even scale-ups? Are there some signals there in this GDP data that one can just take home and say, okay, I think these sectors could be doing well, or there is prospect that I could enter this sector as a business person?
Yes, absolutely. When you look at the GDP figure and disaggregate it, you look at what sectors are showing consistent growth or what sectors are recovering. I had mentioned that the financial service sector was the fastest growing the entire year, followed by the trade sector, then followed by the likes of telecommunication sector. And this sector that are growing fast are the sector that brought strong opportunities for investment purposes. The sector that are declining, we should ask ourselves why are they declining. I mentioned agriculture sector, despite all the incentives going into that sector. The manufacturing sector, I've also talked about what is incentivizing growth in the manufacturing sector. We've talked extensively on what we need to do on the construction industry, the real estate sector. These are sectors. So what you look at is that what is the source of this sector and what are the potentials for growth, and then what rate is it growing? And then if you see a gap between the potential growth capacity of that sector and what is growing, you see opportunities for investment. But it simply means if you do the right things in that sector, you see a faster growth and you can actually appropriate value, which you would have created in investing in that sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chukwu. Let's talk sometime again. Thank you for answering the questions, especially the one of the stay-at-home order in the southeast, because as we speak right now, those states are on lockdown. Nobody's working. Even banks do not work, financial services, and everybody is just keeping mum. It's really beats me. But thank you very much, Mr. Chukwu, for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure.
All right, I've been speaking with Johnson Chukwu, who is the Group Managing Director at Cowry Asset Management. We've been looking at the GDP numbers that were released just a few days ago by the National Bureau of Statistics. In case you didn't see that, please just go online, check it out, and read those details. Those little details, not even little, can just give you insight. You can also check out our YouTube channel, Moneyline with Nancy TV, and check out the interviews that we even did last week on the same topic. from different angles. That's the address on the screen, Moneyline with Nancy TV, our social media handle. So you can get on there right now, join our Twitter community by commenting, by sending your questions and your views. And I always talk about this YouTube channel. Just go on our YouTube channel and check out different interviews, different topics that we've conducted. Who knows, you may just have insight on some things that you've been looking for. All right, let's quickly take a break. And when we return, the program continues. Don't go anywhere.